The laughter was the part she never forgot. Not the cold, not the hunger, not even the 3 years she had spent cutting her hands on frozen ground, stacking bales of straw one by one, while the rest of the Ashford pack watched from a distance and smiled at her foolishness. It was the laughter that stayed, sharp and specific, like a splinter buried too deep to pull out cleanly. She could still hear it, Lord Cedric's low, rolling amusement, the way he had leaned against the fence post with his arms crossed and called out to her across the frost-hardened field. "Straw, Mabel. You're building your future out of straw?" And she had kept working, because that was what she did. Mabel Voss was 23 years old and had been told, in one form or another, that she was not enough for as long as she could remember. Not strong enough. Not fast enough. Not wolf enough. As an Omega in the Ashford pack, her rank sat at the very bottom of a hierarchy that had been carved in stone long before she was born, and no amount of quiet competence had ever moved it. She had no wolf. That was the truth at the center of everything, the silence inside her where a second self should have lived. Other wolves heard their inner animal like a second heartbeat, a warmth beneath the ribs, a voice in moments of danger. Mabel heard nothing. She never had. The pack healers had called it a dormancy. Lord Cedric had called it a defect. The children in the pack halls had simply called her the empty one, which was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had ever said about her. She had stopped flinching at it years ago, or so she told herself. The cabin had been her idea, and her labor and her stubbornness made physical. She had read about straw bale construction in one of the old agricultural texts in the pack's library, a thick, dry volume that no one else had touched in decades, its spine cracked and its pages smelling of dust and beeswax. The technique was ancient, used in the coldest northern territories before timber became the standard of any pack worth its name. Compressed straw bales stacked between timber frames, sealed with lime plaster, created walls with insulating properties that conventional wood cabins could not match. She had understood it immediately, with the kind of quiet certainty that sometimes arrived in her chest when she read about things the world had forgotten. She had also understood that no one would help her. She had been right on both counts. For 18 months she had worked alone, rising before dawn, borrowing the pack's draft horse on the days when Lord Cedric was too distracted by council business to notice, hauling bales from the storage barns at the edge of the territory. Her hands had bled. Her shoulders had screamed. She had cried exactly twice. Once in October when a wall section collapsed after a storm, and once in February when she found that someone had moved 3 of her finished bales to use as horse bedding without asking. She had rebuilt both times. She had said nothing. The pack had found it endlessly entertaining. Lord Cedric's daughter, Petra, had brought her friends to watch on 2 separate occasions. They had stood at the fence in their fine wool riding coats, laughing behind their gloves, calling out suggestions in bright, mocking voices. Why not use real timber, Mabel? Why not ask someone with actual strength? Why not accept that this is beyond you? Petra's laughter had been the loudest, clear and pretty and entirely without cruelty in her own mind, Mabel suspected. To Petra, Mabel was simply amusing. A small, strange girl with straw in her hair, and no wolf and no future, constructing something that would never matter. The cabin had been finished in late autumn. It stood at the northern edge of the Ashford territory, tucked against a rise of pine trees, small and solid and lime-white, its roof thick with insulating layers, its windows fitted with the heaviest shutters she had been able to afford on the allowance Lord Cedric provided, barely enough for salt and tallow candles each month. She had bartered her embroidery work with the pack's seamstress to afford the iron hinges. She had traded herb knowledge with the healer's assistant for the extra timber she needed for the doorframe. She had done it entirely without asking Lord Cedric for a single additional coin, because she had learned long ago that asking him for anything came with a cost she couldn't always see until it was too late. The pack had gone quiet on the day she moved in. Not respectful quiet. Just finished. They had laughed. She had built it anyway, and now they had simply moved on to ignoring her entirely, which was, in its own way, a relief. That was the first week of November. The blizzard arrived in the second week of December. Mabel heard it coming before she saw it. She had been outside at dusk, checking the stack of cut pine she kept covered against the eastern wall, when the wind shifted. It was a small thing, a change in direction, a drop in temperature that landed against her face like a cold hand pressing flat. She stood still and listened. The forest had gone quiet in the particular way that forests went quiet before something large happened. The birds had stopped. The trees were not moving, even though the air was beginning to coil. She looked north and saw the sky over the ridge had turned a color she had no good word for. Not gray, not white, but something between the two that felt heavy and absolute. She went inside and bolted the shutters. She built the fire up high and fed it steadily for the next 2 hours, banking it carefully so it would hold through the night. She had 3 weeks of food stored, enough dried herbs to last a winter, 2 wool blankets, a heavy sheepskin, and a supply of tallow candles she had rationed carefully since October. She was not comfortable. Comfort was a word that had always seemed to apply to other people's lives. But she was prepared. She sat beside the fire as the storm announced itself against the walls, and she listened to the straw hold. It held extraordinarily well. The sound outside was enormous. She had heard winter storms before. In the main pack hall with its drafty stone corridors and its rattling wooden shutters, where the cold crept under every door and the fire in the great hearth ate wood like a hungry animal and still failed to warm the far ends of the room. This was different. The walls around her barely vibrated. The fire burned steadily. The temperature inside dropped perhaps 2 degrees over the course of 4 hours, while the world outside became a white, screaming chaos. She fell asleep near midnight. She woke to knocking. Not gentle knocking. Desperate knocking, the kind of sound that a fist makes when the person attached to it has been outside long enough that their hands are no longer working correctly. 3 hard strikes, a pause, then 3 more, and then a voice she recognized despite the wind distorting it beyond recognition. It was Petra. Mabel sat up slowly. The fire had banked low, but the room was still warm, the air still breathable, the candle on the table still a small, steady flame. Outside, the storm was at its full height. She could hear it pressing against the shutters, hear the pine trees groaning under weight they had not expected to carry. She pulled the sheepskin around her shoulders and walked to the door. She did not open it immediately. She stood with her hand on the cold iron bolt, and she thought about every time she had asked for something and been refused. Every meal eaten alone at the end of the servants' table. Every morning she had walked past Petra and her friends and been looked through as though she were not there. Every time Lord Cedric had looked at her across the council room and said her allowance could not be increased, because an Omega's needs were, after all, quite simple. Then she heard the second voice. It was not Petra's. It was lower, rougher, partially carried away by the wind. But it was unmistakably a man's voice, and unmistakably desperate. And underneath the desperation, there was a quality she could not quite name. Authority, perhaps. Or the memory of authority, stripped down by cold and exhaustion to something raw and honest. Mabel opened the door. The figures on her threshold were barely recognizable as the people she knew. Petra was wrapped in a riding cloak that had been designed for autumn travel, not a December blizzard, her blonde hair crusted with ice, her face a colorless mask of shock and cold. Behind her stood a man Mabel had never seen before, extraordinarily tall, dressed in travel-worn leathers under a dark wool cloak that had clearly been magnificent once and was now soaked through and edged with ice. His hair was braided back in dark rows, and his eyes, when they met hers, through the howling white chaos of the storm, were the color of deep water. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not desperation, exactly. Something more measured than that. Something that acknowledged, with absolute clarity, that she was the one holding the door. "Please," Petra said. Her voice was cracked and small. "Mabel, please." Mabel looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped back and opened the door wide. She gave them the sheepskin first. Not because she felt generous. She was not sure what she felt, standing in the center of her small cabin watching Petra Ashford shiver against the wall like a wet cat stripped of all its usual elegance. It was more that the practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through 3 years of calculated neglect, simply identified the most urgent problem and moved toward it. Hypothermia did not care about rank. Cold did not negotiate. She pulled the sheepskin from the chair by the fire and held it out, and Petra took it with shaking hands and said nothing, which was perhaps the most honest response she had ever offered Mabel in her life. The man was another matter. He had come inside and stopped just past the threshold, and he stood there now taking in the cabin with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely surprised by what he was seeing. Not mockingly surprised. Not the wide, performative astonishment Petra's friends had displayed at the fence during construction, turning amazement into ammunition. This was quieter than that. He moved his gaze slowly across the lime-plastered walls, the low ceiling with its compressed insulation, the fire that was burning steadily in the small stone hearth, the organized shelves of dried herbs and stored food, the stack of folded wool in the corner. His expression did not change much, but something in his posture shifted. A slight release of the tension across his shoulders, as though he had walked into a place that was structurally trustworthy, and some deep part of him had registered it before his mind caught up. Then he looked at her. "You built this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Mabel said. He nodded once, as though confirming something to himself, and moved toward the fire without being invited. She watched him crouch in front of the hearth and hold his hands toward the heat, and she noted the way he did it, without dramatics, without the theatrical shuddering that Petra was still performing behind her. He was controlled even in exhaustion. His cloak, now that she could see it clearly, bore a crest at the left shoulder that she almost recognized. Dark fabric, a silver thread worked into a shape she could not make out while it was wet and pressed against the wool. "Who are you?" she asked. Petra made a small sound from the corner, something between a warning and embarrassment. The man glanced back at her over his shoulder. His eyes in the firelight were darker than they had appeared at the door. Not cold, exactly, but unreadable. "Dominic," he said. "I was traveling through the northern pass when the storm closed it. Your Packlord's Hall was the nearest shelter marked on the route maps, but the road was already impassable. We found the fence line in the dark." He paused. "Your light was the only one visible." Mabel absorbed this. She looked at Petra. "You were traveling with him?" "I was..." Petra stopped, pressed her lips together. Some calculation was happening behind her eyes, and Mabel watched it without expression. "I was accompanying Lord Ashford's delegation to the northern border meeting. We were separated from the main party when the storm turned faster than the scouts predicted. Where are the others? We don't know." Dominic said it plainly, without distress, as though uncertainty was a condition he had learned to carry without it breaking him. "There were 4 of us in the rear carriage. The horses panicked when a tree came down across the road. By the time I had them under control, we had lost sight of the others. Petra and I made it to the fence line on foot. Mabel thought about the road she knew from memory, the way it curved south past the Pine Ridge before it reached the pack hall, the ditch that ran along its eastern side that would be invisible under snowfall of this depth. She thought about 4 people in a carriage on that road in this storm, and she felt the familiar compression in her chest that arrived whenever she was about to do something that would cost her something. "I have dried venison and root broth," she said. "The fire will hold through the night. There's floor space beside the hearth." Neither of them said thank you immediately, which she found strangely more bearable than if they had. Petra eventually unwound enough to sit closer to the fire. Mabel heated broth in the iron pot she kept hung on the hook above the flames, adding dried herbs from the small bundles that hung from the ceiling beam. Thyme, rosemary, a twist of dried onion. The smell filled the cabin quickly, warm and sharp and honest. She watched Petra's shoulders drop about 2 inches when the steam reached her. Dominic ate without comment, but finished everything she gave him, which she also found more honest than gratitude would have been. The storm outside continued its enormous work. It was sometime during the 3rd hour, while Petra had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep against the sheepskin, that Dominic spoke again. He was sitting with his back against the far wall, near enough to the fire to be warm but positioned with a clear line of sight to the door. She noticed that about him, the unconscious tactical placement of his body in any given space. He had removed the outer cloak, which was now drying over the back of the chair, and she could see the crest on his leather armor clearly for the first time. Her breath stopped for just a moment. It was the Varek seal, the silver wolf's head on a black field. She knew it from the territorial maps in the Pack library, from the historical records she had read, because no one had ever thought to tell her she shouldn't. The Varek line held the northern territories, all of them, the full sweep of land from the Ashbourne Ridge to the coast. They were not a pack. They were a dynasty. And at the head of that dynasty, as of 4 years ago when the old king had passed the bloodline crown to his son, was a man named Dominic Varek, the Alpha King. She was looking at the Alpha King of the northern reaches, and he was sitting on her floor eating root broth from a tin cup she had bought at a market stall for 2 copper coins. She kept her face very still. He was watching her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his default: quiet, attentive, unhurried. As though he had unlimited patience for whatever she was about to say or do, and had already decided not to be surprised by it. "You know who I am," he said. "I recognize the seal." And nothing," Mabel said. "The broth is the same either way." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of one. Most people react differently. "Most people haven't spent 3 winters being looked through by a lord who outranks them," she said, before she had fully decided to say it. "It adjusts your relationship with authority." The almost smile settled into something more considered. He looked at her for a moment with that unhurried attention. "Lord Cedric Ashford," he said. "He's your pack lord." "He is." "And your rank in this pack?" She held his gaze. "Omega, no wolf. No standing in the hierarchy beyond what's assigned by default to anyone who hasn't earned a place at the adult table." She said it flatly, without apology or performance of pain. It was simply true, and she had long since stopped pretending it didn't shape every hour of her life. Dominic said nothing immediately. He looked at the walls of her cabin, at the solid, careful construction, the organized stores, the fire burning with the efficiency of someone who had learned to stretch every piece of wood as far as it would go. Then he looked back at her. "Who taught you straw bale construction?" he asked. She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. "A book," she said. "In the Pack library. Agricultural records from the old northern settlements." "Which settlements?" "The Halvern colonies. Before they consolidated south." He was quiet again. His eyes moved over the walls once more, and this time she read something in his expression that she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. Not pity, not amusement. Something that sat closer to respect, though she was careful not to trust that reading. She had been wrong before about what she saw in men's faces. The Halvorn technique requires the bales to be compressed to a specific density before plastering, he said. Otherwise the walls settle unevenly, and the plaster cracks within the first freeze cycle. Mabel looked at him. "Yes," she said slowly. "I weighted them. I used the draft horse and a wooden press I built from fence planks." "The specifications for that press aren't in the standard agricultural texts," he said. They're in a secondary appendix that was bound separately and usually lost. It was folded inside the back cover, she said. Someone had tucked it there. I almost missed it. He nodded, and then, with the same unhurried quality that characterized everything he did, he said, "The Halvern Record Archive is in the Varric Keep Library. I have the full collection. 12 volumes, all appendices intact." He paused. "I've never met anyone outside the keep who had read any part of it." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm pressed against her walls, and her walls held, and the fire burned. And across the small room, the AlphaKing of the northern reaches was looking at her the way no one in the Ashford pack had ever looked at her, as though she were someone worth the full weight of his attention. She did not know what to do with that. She picked up her own tin cup and drank her broth, and looked at the fire and said nothing, because she had learned a long time ago that the wisest response to something unexpected was to wait and see whether it was real. The storm lasted 3 days. Mabel had not planned for guests. She had planned for herself, for the particular arithmetic of one person's survival, measured in firewood and dried meat, and the number of candles left in the tin box on the shelf. 2 additional people changed every calculation, and she spent the first morning quietly reworking the numbers in her head, while Petra slept, and Dominic sat near the window, watching the white wall of the blizzard with the focused patience of a man who had learned to treat waiting as productive work. She rationed carefully. Smaller portions of broth, stretched with extra water, and the dried mushrooms she had been saving. The firewood she fed in measured pieces, maintaining the temperature without waste. Petra complained once on the second morning that the broth was thin. Mabel looked at her without expression and said nothing. Petra did not complain again. What surprised her was how little space Dominic took up, for a man of his size and rank. He did not pace. He did not issue instructions or make demands or position himself at the center of every room the way Lord Cedric did, filling space with his authority until everyone else had to arrange themselves around the edges. Dominic simply existed in whatever corner of the cabin was least inconvenient. When she needed to reach the herb shelf above his head, he moved before she asked. When she was tending the fire, he stayed back. When she carried the heavy water pot from the snow she had melted in the stone basin outside the door, he took it from her without comment and set it over the fire himself, and then returned to his place against the wall, as though he had done nothing worth noting. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. On the second afternoon, while Petra was sleeping again, she slept a great deal, Mabel noticed, in the way that frightened people did, using unconsciousness as a place to hide from circumstances they couldn't control. Dominic asked if he could look at her books. She had a small collection on the shelf beside the herbs. Not many. Books were expensive, and her allowance left little room for luxury. But she had chosen them carefully over years. The agricultural text she had used for the construction. 2 volumes on medicinal plants native to the Northern Territories. A thin, battered record of pack law that she had found in a rubbish pile behind the hall when she was 17, and had kept because knowledge of the rules felt important when you were the person the rules were most likely to be used against. A hand-copied collection of old weather patterns from a pack elder who had died the previous winter, and whose belongings had been distributed among the pack. Mabel had asked for the notebooks and been given them because no one else had wanted them. Dominic looked at each one with the same focused attention he brought to everything. He did not rush. He read passages slowly, turned pages carefully, occasionally paused on something, and went still in the particular way he had when something caught his interest. "You've annotated this," he said, holding up the pack law volume. "Yes, in the margins. I know where the margins are." He turned the book slightly, reading her handwriting. His expression did not change, but she had begun to learn the small signals of his attention. The slight tilt of his head, the way his eyes moved more slowly when something was worth considering. "These notes are more precise than the original text," he said. "The original text was written by men who expected to be the ones applying it," Mabel said. Not the ones it was applied to. The annotations are what you see when you read from the other side. He looked up at her then. Full attention, the kind that felt like being genuinely seen rather than evaluated. How long have you been studying pack law? Since I was 17. Why? She kept her hands busy with the herb bundle she was retying, fingers moving through the familiar work while she decided how honest to be. Because Lord Cedric told me when I turned 21 that Omegas without wolves could be formally reassigned to servant status if a pack council voted for it. He said it as though he was informing me of the weather. She paused. I decided I should understand exactly what that vote would require, and exactly what protections existed against it, and exactly which council members had the legal authority to challenge it. Silence. And? Dominic said. And he doesn't have the votes. He never did. 2 of his council members are bound by old alliance agreements that predate his lordship and protect Omega rights in specific circumstances. He either doesn't know that, or assumed I didn't. She tied off the herb bundle. I made sure to know it. Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then he set the book down carefully and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Something layered, something that moved through several stages in rapid succession before settling into something that looked almost like recognition. He's been threatening you, he said. It was not a question. He's been managing me, Mabel said. There's a difference. Threats are direct. What Lord Cedric does is more careful than that. He creates conditions, reduces resources, makes the available options smaller until the one he wants looks like your own choice. How long? Since my father died. 7 years. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the storm pushed against the walls, and the walls absorbed it without complaint, and the temperature inside held steady and warm. Your father was a pack member? Dominic asked. My father was Lord Cedric's younger brother, Mabel said. He held a minor territorial claim on the eastern edge of the Ashford lands. When he died, the claim reverted to the main line, to Cedric. She paused. There was a provision in my father's recorded will that set aside a portion of the eastern land for my future. A small holding. Enough to be independent. She looked at the fire. The document disappeared from the pack records 3 months after my father's funeral. Lord Cedric informed me there was no such provision, that my father had died without property to bequeath. The silence that followed this was different from the previous ones, heavier. You know it existed, Dominic said. I watched my father sign it. I was 16. He signed it at the kitchen table in our house on a Tuesday evening in October, and he gave me a copy and told me to keep it somewhere safe. She reached up and touched the small leather pouch she wore on a cord beneath her dress. An unconscious gesture, quickly checked. Lord Cedric doesn't know I have it. He assumed a 16-year-old girl would have lost a piece of paper in 7 years. Something shifted in Dominic's expression, sharp and quiet, like a door being opened in a dark room. Mabel, he said, and it was the first time he had used her name, and something about the way he said it. Level, direct, without the slight condescension that everyone in the Ashford pack layered under her name as naturally as breathing, made her look at him fully. That document, if it is what you say it is, constitutes legal grounds for a territorial dispute under Northern pack law, specifically under the Varec Consolidation Statutes, which supersede individual pack lord authority in cases of inheritance fraud. She stared at him. I know the statutes, she said carefully. Then you know a formal challenge requires the document to be presented before a recognized authority with jurisdiction over the territory. Yes. You know what jurisdiction the Varec title carries over the Ashford lands. The fire popped. Petra shifted in her sleep. Mabel looked at the man sitting against her wall, at the Varec seal on his armor, at the steady quality of his attention, at the way he was watching her with something that felt dangerously close to purpose. You have full jurisdiction, she said slowly. The Ashford territory falls within the northern reaches. Your authority supersedes Lord Cedric's in matters of pack law by the consolidation treaty he signed with your father 11 years ago. Yes, Dominic said. You're telling me... I'm telling you what the law says, he said. What you do with that information is your decision. She was quiet for a long moment. Her hands had gone still in her lap. The leather pouch against her chest felt suddenly very present, very real. The folded paper inside it, the ink she had watched dry on a Tuesday evening in October, while her father had said, "This is yours, Mabel. Whatever happens, this land is yours." "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Dominic looked at her steadily. "Because you let us in from the storm," he said. "And because you've been reading the right books for 7 years and no one with the authority to act on them has ever been in the room." He paused. "I'm in the room now." She should not trust this. She knew that with the part of her mind that had kept her alive through 7 years of careful survival, the part that watched for the shape of the trap inside the gift, the cost concealed inside the offer. She had learned that lesson so thoroughly it had become reflex. Trust was a door she kept bolted. And yet, he had not asked her for anything. He had not positioned himself as her rescuer, or made her feel small in the process of being generous. He had simply told her what the law said, and left the rest entirely with her, and gone back to watching the fire with that unhurried patience of his, as though he had all the time in the world, and no particular need for her to decide anything tonight. Outside, the storm screamed against the straw walls. Inside, the walls held. On the third morning, the wind stopped. Mabel was awake before dawn, as she always was. She unbolted the shutter and looked out into a world so white and still, it barely seemed real. Snow piled in smooth, enormous drifts against the pine trees. The sky above them clearing to a pale winter blue, the air sharp and clean and silent in a way that felt almost sacred after 3 days of chaos. She heard movement behind her. Dominic was awake too, standing in the center of the room, already reaching for his cloak. He looked at the pale light coming through the window, then at her. "The pass road will need clearing before a carriage can use it," he said. "My people will come looking when the storm breaks. They'll reach the fence line by midday." "I know," Mabel said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Come with us to the pack hall," he said. "Not as a guest. As a witness to a legal proceeding. Bring the document." Mabel looked out at the white, still world her cabin had kept her safe from. Then she went to the shelf, took down the leather pouch, and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the worn softness of it, the weight of 7 years of patience compressed into a single folded page. "All right," she said. The Ashford Pack Hall looked different when you walked into it beside the AlphaKing. Mabel had entered that building hundreds of times over 7 years, through the servants' side door mostly, head down, footsteps quiet, making herself as small and unremarkable as possible, because that was the safest way to move through a space where your presence was tolerated, rather than welcomed. She knew every stone of its floor, every draft in its corridors, every way the firelight fell short in the eastern wing where the heating was poor and the tapestries were thin. She knew the way the great hall smelled in winter, tallow smoke and damp wool, and the particular mustiness of old timber that had absorbed decades of meals and arguments and pack politics. She had never walked through the front door. She walked through it now. Dominic's people had arrived at the fence line exactly when he had predicted. 4 riders and a heavy travel carriage, moving through the broken snow with the organized efficiency of a household that had been searching methodically since the storm broke. The reunion had been quiet on his end. No dramatics. His head guard, a broad-shouldered woman named Soren, with silver-streaked hair and a scar across her jaw, had simply looked at him, confirmed he was uninjured, and begun organizing the return route without ceremony. The others had followed her lead. It was a different kind of authority than anything Mabel had seen in the Ashford Pack. Not performed, not enforced through visible dominance, just present, like the structure of a well-built wall. Petra had been collected by a pack rider who had clearly been sent specifically for her. She had climbed into the carriage with the stiff movements of someone who had spent 3 days being humbled and was not yet sure how to carry it. Before she disappeared inside, she had paused and looked back at Mabel standing in the snow beside her cabin. The look on her face was not gratitude exactly. It was more complicated than that. Something between acknowledgement and discomfort. The expression of a person who had discovered that someone they had dismissed was more substantial than they had allowed themselves to see. She had opened her mouth, closed it again, and then said, very quietly, "The walls didn't move at all. During the storm, not once." "No," Mabel had agreed. "They didn't." Petra had nodded once and gotten into the carriage. Now Mabel stood in the great hall of the Ashford packhouse and watched Lord Cedric Ashford's face move through a rapid and involuntary sequence of expressions as Dominic walked in beside her. Surprise first. Genuine. Unguarded. The kind that arrived before the political mind could intercept it. Then a swift recalibration. The smooth assumption of welcome and deference, his arms opening in a gesture of hospitality that his eyes did not quite support. Then, fractionally delayed, the moment when his gaze moved to Mabel and the welcome thinned at its edges. "My Lord Varric," Cedric said, his voice warm and practiced. "We feared the worst when the storm broke, and our riders found the carriage abandoned on the North Road. I am profoundly relieved to see you well." "Lord Ashford," Dominic said. He did not extend his hand. He stood in the center of the hall with his cloak still on, Soren at his left shoulder, and he did not move toward Cedric's offered greeting. Just waited, with that quality of stillness that Mabel had spent 3 days learning to read. The kind that was not passive but deliberate. The stillness of someone who understood that making another person come to you was its own form of authority. Cedric came to him. "I understand you found shelter during the storm," Cedric said, his eyes moving once more to Mabel. "I trust our Mabel was hospitable." The possessive word was casual, practiced. Our Mabel. The way you said "our" about something that belonged to you, that you managed, that had no independent standing beyond its relationship to you. "She was exceptional," Dominic said. The word landed in the room without elaboration, and Cedric absorbed it with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Wonderful. Then we are all grateful for her." "I've called a legal proceeding," Dominic said. "Under the authority of the Varric Consolidation Statutes, and my jurisdiction as AlphaKing of the Northern Reaches, over all pack territories within its boundary, including Ashford lands." He paused. One beat, precise as a dropped stone. "I'll need your council assembled within the hour. All members, including the 2 bound under the Halvern Alliance agreements." The color that left Cedric's face in that moment was not dramatic. It was quiet. A slow withdrawal, like water pulling back from a shore. His smile held its shape but lost its warmth entirely, and his eyes moved to Mabel with an expression she had seen before, in smaller forms, over 7 years. Calculation, reassessment, the look of a man rapidly reconstructing a situation he had believed was under control. She met his gaze and held it, and did not look away. She had never not looked away before. Something shifted in his expression. A new kind of attention, sharp and cold. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Whatever his lordship requires." The council chamber was a long room with a stone floor and a heavy oak table that had witnessed decades of pack decisions. 7 council members took their seats with the uncomfortable energy of people who had been pulled from their morning routines without adequate explanation. Mabel sat at the far end of the table, not in a council seat, but in a chair that Soren had placed there without asking anyone's permission, which had produced a moment of visible tension that Soren had simply waited out until it resolved itself. Dominic stood at the head of the table. He was not a man who used many words in formal settings, she was learning. He stated the matter plainly. a territorial inheritance dispute under Pack law, a document requiring verification, a challenge to the recorded disposition of the late Edric Voss's eastern landholding. He used the precise legal language of the statutes without ornamentation, and the council members who knew what those statutes meant began exchanging looks before he had finished the first paragraph. Cedric sat 3 seats down with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged in an expression of patient attention that cost him visible effort to maintain. Mabel placed the leather pouch on the table. She untied the cord slowly, her hands steady. She had decided somewhere between the cabin and this room that her hands would be steady today, whatever else happened. She unfolded the document with care. 7 years of being carried against her body had softened the paper at the creases, but the ink was clear, the signatures intact, the pack seal her father had pressed into the wax at the bottom still sharp in its impression. She set it on the table and slid it toward Dominic. He read it without haste. Then he passed it to Soren, who read it and passed it to the council member nearest her, one of the 2 bound by the Halvern alliance agreements, an older man named Aldrich with white eyebrows and the watchful face of someone who had been in pack politics long enough to recognize the shape of what he was looking at. Aldrich read it twice. Then he looked up at Cedric. "This document is dated," Aldrich said carefully, 7 years and 3 months ago. It carries Edric Voss's signature and seal, witnessed by 2 additional signatures, and it is recorded in the old territorial notation that was standard before the consolidation reforms. He set it down. "Cedric, the pack records show no such document." "Because no such document existed in the pack records," Cedric said. His voice was level. "Whatever that paper claims to be, I can assure the council." "The paper doesn't need your assurance," Dominic said, quietly. "It needs verification." He looked at Aldrich. "You knew Edric Voss." "For 30 years, Aldrich said. "Is that his signature?" Aldrich looked at the document again for a long moment. The room was very still. "Yes," he said. "That is his signature." What happened to Cedric's face in that moment was not collapse. He was too controlled for that. It was more like a structure that had been load-bearing for years, finally meeting a weight it could not distribute. Small, almost invisible. But Mabel saw it. And she believed that Dominic saw it too, because he gave it exactly 1 second before he continued. Under the Varick Consolidation Statutes, Article 14, the suppression or removal of a verified inheritance document from pack records constitutes grounds for immediate review of the responsible lord's territorial authority, Dominic said. The eastern land holding reverts to its designated recipient pending formal review. That review will be conducted by my office within 30 days. He paused. Lord Ashford, you will surrender the documentation of the eastern holding to my headguard before we leave today. The council will record this proceeding in full. Cedric was looking at Mabel. She looked back at him with the same steadiness she had held since they entered the room. She did not feel triumph exactly. The thing in her chest was bigger and quieter than triumph, more like the sensation of a door being opened that she had spent 7 years pressing her weight against. She felt the solid reality of the document on the table. Her father's handwriting, the ink that had not faded, the words that had survived everything Cedric had tried to bury them under. This land is yours, Mabel. Whatever happens, this land is yours. It had taken 7 years, and a 3-day blizzard, and a man who read the right books. But the door was open. The proceedings lasted most of the day. Aldrich and the second alliance-bound council member, a sharp-faced woman named Doris, who said little but recorded everything with meticulous care, proved to be exactly the obstacles to Cedric's authority that Mabel had always calculated they would be, if properly activated. What she had never had before was someone with the jurisdictional standing to activate them. By late afternoon, the Eastern landholding had been formally placed in legal review. Cedric had been required to submit to a full audit of the pack records under Soren's supervision. a process that Soren had begun with the organized efficiency of someone who had done this before and expected it to produce additional findings, which Mabel suspected it would. Cedric himself had been quiet since the council chamber. He moved through his own hall with the careful steps of a man recalculating everything, and he did not look at Mabel again, which was its own kind of answer. Petra found her in the corridor outside the council chamber, as the light was going gray through the high windows. She stopped a few feet away and stood with her hands folded in front of her, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I didn't know," Petra said finally, "about the document, about what my father did." Mabel looked at her. She considered this, the difference between not knowing and not asking, between ignorance and the comfortable incuriosity of someone who had never needed to look closely at the mechanisms that kept her comfortable. "I believe you," she said. "That's not the same as it not having happened." Petra absorbed this, nodded once, slowly. "No," she said. "It's not." It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. But it was honest. And honesty was something Mabel had always valued more than comfort, which was perhaps why she had never had much of either. She walked back down the corridor toward the light. The eastern landholding was smaller than she remembered. Mabel stood at its boundary on a morning in late January, 6 weeks after the blizzard, and looked at the frozen field that stretched toward the tree line her father had planted the year she was born. Ash trees, mostly, thin and silver-barked in winter, their bare branches making a delicate pattern against the pale sky. He had planted them because ash wood was useful for almost everything, he had told her once. Tool handles, bow staves, barrel hoops. Practical beauty, he had called it. She had been perhaps 7 years old and had not entirely understood what he meant, but she had remembered it, the way children remembered things that felt important before they could articulate why. She understood it now. The audit of the Ashford Pack records had taken 3 weeks and had produced, as Soren had predicted, additional findings. 2 other documentation irregularities, both involving land that had transferred to Cedric's direct control in the years following his brother's death. Neither was as clear-cut as Mabel's inheritance document, but both were sufficient, in combination with the verified suppression of her father's will provision, to constitute a pattern of deliberate manipulation under Pack law. Dominic had not returned to the north immediately. He had remained at the Ashford Pack Hall for the duration of the audit, which Mabel suspected was not strictly necessary from a logistical standpoint, and was in fact a choice, a quiet exercise of continued presence that kept the proceedings from being quietly pressured into narrower conclusions. He had attended the formal sessions, reviewed the findings each evening with Soren and Aldrich, and said relatively little publicly. What he said privately, he said to Mabel, in the brief and practical conversations they had found themselves in during those weeks. In the library where she had gone to read and found him already there, at the council chamber door after long sessions, once in the kitchen corridor very early in the morning when neither of them could sleep. She had told him about her father. Not everything. She was not a person who gave everything at once, and she did not think he expected her to be. But enough. The ash trees he had planted. The kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. The way he had said whatever happens as though he had known something was coming, and wanted to build her a door out of it in advance. Dominic had listened the way he did everything, fully, without rushing her toward a point, or offering the kind of ready comfort that was really just a request for her to stop. He had simply been there, on the other side of the conversation, which was more than most people had managed in 7 years. The formal review concluded in the 3rd week of January. Cedric Ashford was removed from his position as Pack Lord. It was not a violent ending. There were no raised voices in the council chamber when Dominic read the findings and the determination. Just a long, heavy silence. And then Aldrich speaking the formal words of the council's concurrence. And then the scratch of Doris's pen recording it all in her meticulous hand. Cedric sat through it with the stillness of a man who had seen it coming for some time, and had spent his preparation not on prevention, but on composure. He did not argue. He did not appeal. He simply sat and listened. And when it was finished, he rose and walked out of the chamber with his hands behind his back and his chin level. And that was the last time Mabel ever sat in a room with him. He was relocated to a minor holding on the southern edge of the territory, stripped of his lordship, but not his life or his basic standing. The law did not demand more than that, and Dominic had not pushed for more than the law required, which Mabel had watched carefully and found significant. There was a difference between justice and punishment performed as power, and he had held that line with the same precision he brought to everything. Aldrich was appointed interim pack lord, pending a full council election. The eastern landholding was returned to Mabel in a document signed by Dominic himself, witnessed by Soren and Aldrich, recorded by Doris in triplicate, and placed in both the Ashford Pack records and the Varric Territorial Archive, where it could not be quietly removed by anyone without consequences that would reach the AlphaKing's office directly. She had held the document for a long time after they gave it to her. Not reading it, she had already read it 3 times before she left the chamber. Just holding it. Feeling the weight of a thing that had been true for 7 years, finally becoming officially, irrevocably real. Dominic found her at the ash tree boundary on that January morning, which did not surprise her. He had a reliable instinct for where she was when something significant was happening, which she had stopped trying to explain away as coincidence. He came and stood beside her at a comfortable distance, and looked at the frozen field and the silver trees, and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things she had come to value most about him, that he understood silence as a form of presence, rather than an absence of it. "The ground will be workable by April," she said eventually. "The soil under the frost line is better than I expected. My father maintained it well. What will you plant?" She had been thinking about this for weeks. Rye first, to restore the field, then kitchen crops along the southern edge where the light is better. "I want to expand the herb cultivation. There's demand for medicinal herbs in the northern markets that isn't being met by the current pack suppliers." She paused. "And I want to build a proper structure. Not the cabin. That stays. But a working building. Storage. A drying room for the herbs. Space for the equipment I'll need." "Straw bale?" he said. She could hear something in his voice that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same space. "Stone foundation, straw bale walls, slate roof," she said. "The Halvern technique with the modifications I've been developing. The cabin taught me 3 things I'd do differently at larger scale." "I'd like to see those modifications," he said. "When you're ready to share them." The Varric Keep library doesn't have anything past the original 12 volumes, and the technique deserves a current practitioner's record. She looked at him then. He was watching the ash trees with his hands clasped behind his back, his breath making small clouds in the cold air, his dark braids tucked under the collar of his cloak against the January chill. He looked different here than he had looked in her cabin. Not smaller, but more specific somehow, like a thing seen in better light. "You're asking me to write it down," she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to. The archive is always interested in practical knowledge that isn't being preserved anywhere else." He paused. "And I'm told the Varric Keep library has considerably more shelf space than a straw bale cabin at the northern edge of the Ashford territory." She was quiet for a moment. "You're inviting me to the keep." "I'm inviting you to consider it," he said. "Not as a guest. Not as someone under jurisdiction or obligation. As someone whose knowledge and judgment I respect, and whose company I have found." He paused briefly, choosing his word with care. "Worthwhile. There is a position in the Keep's Agricultural Advisory Council that has been vacant for 2 years because I haven't found anyone I trusted to fill it. I am offering it to you, if you want it." Mabel looked back at the ash trees. She thought about her father's kitchen table, the folded document against her chest that was now a formal legal record in 2 separate archives, the straw walls that had held through a blizzard while the people who had laughed at her huddled inside them. She thought about 7 years of making herself small in other people's spaces, and how it had made her extraordinarily precise about what she built and why, and how that precision was maybe the most valuable thing she owned. She thought about the moment at the cabin door when she had chosen to open it. "The Eastern Land will need a steward while I'm away," she said. "Aldrich has 3 reliable people he can recommend," Dominic said immediately, which meant he had already thought about this, which she filed away without comment. "And I'll need access to the full Halvern archive, all 12 volumes, appendices included. They're already in the North Reading Room. I had them moved there when I returned to collect my things." She turned to look at him fully. He met her gaze with that level, unhurried attention of his, and she searched it for what she always searched for in offers that seemed too straightforward. The shape of the cost, the concealed condition, the thing that would make her smaller in the accepting of it. She found none of those things. What she found instead was simply him, steady and clear-eyed in the cold morning light, waiting without pressure for whatever she decided. "All right," she said, for the second time in 2 months. It had been the right answer the first time. She thought it was the right answer now. She moved to Verrick Keep in the first week of February. The Eastern Land went into the care of a steward named Bram, a quiet and thorough man recommended by Aldrich, who treated the ash trees with the respectful practicality they deserved, and sent her written reports every 2 weeks, in a careful hand. The cabin stood empty, but maintained. She had left it stocked and sealed, the fire laid and ready, the shutters bolted against the winter. It would be there when she returned in spring to begin the foundation work. Some things were worth returning to. Petra remained in the Ashford territory. She was not the same as she had been before the blizzard. Something in those 3 days had rearranged her in ways that were quiet but visible, and she had become, in the weeks following the proceedings, a more careful presence in the pack than she had been before. She had written Mabel a letter in late January. Not an apology exactly. Mabel had not asked for one and would not have known what to do with it. More of an acknowledgement. "I see now that I did not look," she had written, in her neat, slightly formal hand. "I intend to look more carefully going forward." It was honest, which was the most Mabel had ever required of anyone. She had written back. They were not friends, but they were no longer nothing to each other, which was a different kind of beginning. Aldrich proved to be exactly the pack lord the Ashford territory needed: methodical, fair, disinclined toward performance, and interested in substance. Under his interim leadership, the 2 other documentation irregularities were fully corrected, the affected parties compensated where possible, and the pack records reorganized under a system that Doris had apparently been wanting to implement for 15 years, and had now finally been given the authority to execute. Order arrived not as a sudden transformation, but as a slow, reliable improvement, the kind that held because it was built on accurate foundations. Cedric lived out his years quietly in the southern holding. He did not attempt to contest the findings. He did not write letters or seek audiences. He simply withdrew from the life he had arranged for himself, and the territory continued without him in ways that suggested it had been doing most of the work independently for quite some time. At Verrick Keep, Mabel was given a room in the east wing with a window that faced the ash forests of the northern ridge, and a shelf long enough for twice the number of books she currently owned. She filled it methodically over the following months: agricultural texts, medicinal references, pack law volumes, the complete Halvern archive in its 12 volumes with all appendices intact, exactly as promised. She wrote the modification record herself, in a clear and detailed hand. With diagrams she drew at the work table in the North Reading Room on winter evenings, while the fire in the great hearth burned with the generous consistency of a household that had never needed to ration its wood. She titled it Practical Amendments to the Halvern Straw Bale Construction Method, based on field application in northern conditions, which she acknowledged was not a romantic title but was precisely accurate, and precision had always mattered more to her than romance. Dominic read it when she finished. All of it, including the footnotes, which she had written with the same care as the main text, because footnotes were where the most honest information usually lived. He set it down and looked at her across the reading room table with an expression she had learned, over months of proximity, to read with some confidence. "The amendment to the compression method in Chapter 3, he said. "The weighted press modification. Can it be scaled to larger structures?" "Yes," she said. "With adjustments to the timber frame ratio. I've been calculating those. They're in the appendix." He turned to the appendix. Read it. "You've already solved the scaling problem." "I had a lot of evenings." He looked up at her. The fire crackled between them. Outside, the northern forest was deep and dark and cold, and inside the light was warm, and she was sitting across a table from a man who read the footnotes and asked about the appendix, and had not once, in all the months she had known him, made her feel that her knowledge was less than it was, or her judgment less than reliable. "Mabel," he said. "Yes." "I'm glad you opened the door." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the bolt under her hand, the cold iron of it, the sound of desperate knocking in a blizzard, the calculation she had run in that fraction of a second between hearing his voice and deciding. She thought about everything that had come from that single choice, the legal proceeding, the document finally recognized, the land returned, the steward's careful reports every 2 weeks, the ash trees waiting in the frozen ground for spring. She thought about a kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in October, and a man who had known that building her a door was the most honest thing he could do for her. "So am I," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not a ceremony or a formal recognition or a moment designed to be witnessed. It was just two people in a library at the end of a long winter, telling each other the truth, which was its own kind of foundation, the kind you could build something lasting on. And she did. The eastern land was planted in rye that April. The stone foundation went in by June, the straw bale walls by August, the slate roof completed just before the first frost of the following autumn. Bram sent her a pressed ash leaf with his October report, which she kept between the pages of the modification record. The building stood solid and warm, and exactly as she had designed it, and it did not move at all in the winter storms that followed. Not once, not ever. Mabel Voss, who had been told she was not enough, who had built her future out of straw while they laughed, who had kept a document folded against her heart for 7 years and waited for the room where it would matter, did not disappear into someone else's story. She wrote her own, and it held,